very much. Thank you. It's great when you applaud when I just walk up here. Good morning, my name is Matthew, I'm the lead pastor here, so I want to welcome you. We are, by the way, did you like the paint job outside in the lobby? I can't claim responsibility for that myself, but a lot of people have worked on that, and so thank you to all of them. We're going to kind of change it, every week or so. Spring colours now, maybe, no, we're not really. But it looks a lot fresher and nicer up there, so we're also going to be, after Easter, finally sorting the flooring out outside and along the corridors. Yeah. Has anybody broken their neck yet or stripping over the bumps in the carpet? Nobody yet? So we're going to sort all that out, so we're just smartening the place up a little bit. We are coming to the end of a series today. It's been our Lenten series. We've been going through a book called The Life You've Always Wanted. It's a book about spiritual growth, in particular about spiritual disciplines, different activities we can do to enhance and grow our spiritual lives. The book closes out this week. We're in the last chapter. It's also Palm Sunday. Does anybody have any palms with them? Did you grab some palms when you came in? Just stick your hand up. I just want to get a sense of how many. We've got more. So we're going to use these later. Okay, you can stop waving them now. So we'll be using those in a bit. So if you haven't got one, we've got some more on tables at the back, and we'll grab one. So first of all, suffering. Our favourite subject, right? So I was out last night actually taking a walk with my wife. What a beautiful day it was yesterday, wasn't it? Just such a beautiful day. And we were out last evening walking, and I was walking back thinking, man, I've got to kind of finish off my message. I mean, I'd obviously been working on it weeks ago, just so you know, but just adding the final touches, And I thought, who wants to talk about suffering when you could be out walking, on this beautiful day? So it's going to be a really short message today, right? So that's one good thing. Yeah. Well, loads of people who went before me took up loads of time, so you may not get out here any sooner. So it's about suffering, but it's also Palm Sunday, so we want to kind of address that. And actually, I'm going to try to bring those two things together. Suffering. Last week we talked about the rule of life, or a rule of life. We were looking back over the series, looking at different spiritual practices. I mean, we weren't just talking about them specifically, but we were saying, what kind of rule, what kind of order, if you like, do we want in our lives? What can we do proactively to practice certain things to enhance our spirituality, right? And we were commenting on the fact that we have control over certain things. We can spend a certain amount of time doing stuff like addressing spiritual growth. But we also referenced, and said we'll talk more about it this week, the fact that some things happen in life that we have no control over whatsoever. Some bad things happen in life that we have no control over whatsoever. And those things can cause suffering. And so, but those things can be equally, if not more, formative in our lives, for good or for bad. So spiritual growth, this whole idea of wanting to be fuller people, more whole people, has to do with both what we can do proactively that we have control of, but also, to a large extent, how we respond to what life throws at us. In fact, perhaps it's the latter that defines us more truly, right? Because it's in those situations that we find out who we really are. And perhaps it helps define who we really want to become, who we really want to be. So today we're going to focus on that. Now, what I'm not going to do, as we take on this issue of suffering, let me just say up front what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to give a great philosophical treatise on why we suffer. That's a huge issue, and something that philosophers and religious people and wise people and spiritual people down through the centuries have wrestled with. There's some great books out there on it, there's some great thinking out there on it. I have my own thoughts about it. It's just, we're not going to go there today, right? We're just not going to be able to deal with that from a philosophical point of view. It's connected to the nature of evil, the problem of evil in the world. I mean, I think for religious people, for people like us, people who are Christian, people who are following Jesus, it poses a big challenge because we find it hard to reconcile that there's a being in the universe that has ultimate power, omnipotence, that is also completely loving, and yet also allows terrible things to happen in the universe, terrible things to happen in the world. terrible things to happen to people, terrible things to happen to you and me. And that's really hard to come to terms with. And all I will say about it is, I think it stirs up a lot of doubt in us, right? It certainly causes me to doubt. Right now, I think doubt is a normal part of faith, but it's something that we wrestle with. It's a really complex issue. All right, so we'll be able to come back to that at some point. I mean, I think that's a great topic for us to discuss more at length. But today we're going to focus mainly on the practicalities of it. What is suffering, and how do we deal with it in our daily lives, and how can it be a positive force in our life even, without in any way wanting to assume that all suffering has a redeeming nature, right? I mean, there are people going through horrible things in the world. Some of us here might be going through awful things that have been done to us, or circumstances have created them. And I in no way want to say, oh, don't worry, it's all for a purpose, it's all going to be good, right? I don't really feel like that's helpful. I think we're aware that there is just unspeakable evil in the world, right? We see the news, we now, with all sorts of different media access, can be more aware than ever of what's going on in the world, and it's awful. A lot of things are awful, and this is great beauty of the world, and great happiness, and many wonderful things, but there's this big issue there. Okay, so I don't want to pass over that lightly, but let us think for a moment about the more day-to-day aspect of suffering and struggle, and the need for endurance that we all have in everyday life. And in order to sort of address that, I think it's important for us to kind of set some context by thinking about the whole issue of perhaps what the opposite of suffering is. Maybe not the exact opposite, but its antithesis to some degree, being happiness, right? Because suffering is the absence of happiness, or the absence of happiness is suffering to a large extent. And we are, I think, preoccupied with, if not addicted to, the pursuit of happiness. Right? We're all trying to be happy. We all want to be happy. In fact, happiness, to a large extent, is a measure of how successful we are at life. Right? And so we all want to be successful, and we all want to appear successful in other people's eyes. So we're all desirous of happiness, and even if we don't feel that happy, we often project an image of happiness. Right? And it's, I think it's not hard for us to see how certain media, I'm personally not on Facebook, but and it's very easy to knock Facebook, and I'm not here to knock Facebook, but how Facebook can portray an image of happiness like life's fantastic, because we tend to post the good stuff and not so much the bad stuff. I mean, again, I'm not on Facebook, and maybe I've totally missed that, but I think there's an element within how we portray ourselves to the world, which is a sort of how happy can we portray ourselves, how successful can we portray ourselves. And what happens is that the message goes out that people are way happier than I am. People have way better lives than I have. People are constantly going on vacation, constantly having great experiences, constantly, has anybody ever felt like that? Where it's like, man, my life's pretty mundane. I better start posting something, right? And embellishing maybe a tad here and there, right? Because I don't want to be a loser. And we're pursuing these experiences and this desire to be happy, to capture something that also seems to kind of slip through our fingers. It doesn't quite happen. So to start off with, maybe we can ask a couple of questions. One is the world really all that happy? I mean, is my life all that unusual? I mean, is there something to be said for the reasonable, relatively mundane kind of life? Okay, and I'm conscious here we still haven't got into the terrible things that happen, or the suffering that we might be experiencing. But I guess what I wonder is actually unhappiness and suffering to varying degrees way more common than we'd like to admit. In other words, is that perhaps a bigger issue for us to deal with because it's more prevalent in life? Dealing with adversity, dealing with difficulty, dealing with boredom, dealing with the mundane aspect of life. Is that perhaps the bigger challenge than necessarily the pursuit of happiness? Because what comes at us can often be challenging in life, right? So for that reason alone, maybe we've got to sort of stop and think, how do we deal with this? How do we address this? What is it saying to us? How can it form us? How can it shape us in a really positive way? Because I can't control how happy I'm going to be. I can pursue it, but I can't make it all happen. In fact, I can perhaps pursue some better things. A lot of the researchers, we've talked about here before, a lot of the research into happiness suggests that we're chasing after the wrong things. The things that we think will define happiness for us, which, the top three being money, image, and status, things that we think will create a happy environment for us, actually fail to satisfy. The things that it seems that actually deliver, and this is based on research, Tim Kasser, a psychologist in Knox College in Illinois, has done a lot of work on this. The things that actually do deliver are personal growth, friendships, and helping others. Right? So those things seem to be less about us and our happiness than something bigger than us. So, maybe we can change our pursuit of happiness to some degree, but we've still got to deal with all this stuff that comes down the road at us, and wrestle with that, cope with that, and either let it sink us or respond to it in a way that it can cause us to grow, and cause us to grow in a positive sense. On top of that, let's think about Jesus for a moment. We're going to talk about Palms and Jesus on what has become known as Palm Sunday, walking into Jerusalem. As followers of Jesus, for those of us here who would say, yeah, we're following Jesus, there's no denying that we've been called to something other than happiness. And we'll see in a moment that perhaps even we've been called to a way that's more associated with suffering when we look at the life of Jesus. Now, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we should all be these sort of smouldering martyrs and my life's not worth anything, so I'm going to sacrifice it all for the sake of spirituality or something like that. I mean, obviously this whole notion of a sacrificial life can run very close to a toxic self-martyrdom, right? But let's assume we're not going to get toxic and pathological about it for a moment. Just move that to one side, that we're going to take a healthy approach to it. That I don't think in reading the life of Jesus and the call to follow, that we're being called to pursue happiness. That it's about us. Rather, we've been called to something bigger in the very spirit of Jesus, to even lay our lives down, to give up something for a much greater cause that actually results, ironically, in the alleviation of suffering for many other people. We're going to see that in what Jesus carried out on Palm Sunday as he came into Jerusalem. So I say that by way of a setup to maybe sort of challenge even this notion that we deserve a happy life, or that we're guaranteed a happy life, and maybe we can lay aside for a moment, and again I say this with all respect, I'm speaking to myself as much as anybody else, the fact that I deserve a happy life, and I even demand a happy life, and we devote our life to that sense of happiness. Maybe there are more worthy, more fulfilling causes to devote our lives to. And perhaps, and again, here's the irony, perhaps suffering opens us up to that reality somehow. Perhaps it disrupts our lives enough and shakes us up enough to see what's really real, to see what is ultimately fulfilling, to see what is ultimately good and worth pursuing with our whole hearts. And it opens us up and shakes us up and disrupts us in a way that happiness doesn't seem to do. Happiness just creates a longing for more of it. It keeps us on the same route. It keeps us in the same channels. It keeps us in the same patterns. Suffering, it seems, disrupts us. It's unpleasant. It can be agony. It can be repulsive. But it shakes us up to see life in a very, very different way. Now, I want to make, I suppose, 3 assertions or 3 comments about suffering. And the first one is this, and then I'm going to ask a couple of questions. And we referenced this last week, really. I think for most of us, when we look back on our lives, painful as it may be to admit it, it's the dark times, it's the difficult times that have really formed us. When we think about positive change, transformation, and we're talking here about deep transformation, becoming more whole people, it's somehow in the dark moments, the struggles in which that has happened. Now, I know also that suffering can crush us. I mean, certain things can happen that seem to just almost snuff us out. And there are certain things going on in the world that, again, I fail, maybe I'm just not deep enough, but I fail to see anything redemptive about them whatsoever. But I also know that in my own life, I can look back on awful times of failure and suffering, when it's felt like the bottom's fallen out of my world, and say, man, those are formative times in my life. I don't want to go back there, I don't want to go through them again, I don't wish that on anybody else. But it's transforming. I mean, just a real brief show of hands. Has anybody else had that experience? Okay. Let me ask you, and you don't know if you need to put your hand up, why is that? Why is, I mean, maybe some people could suggest, what is it about suffering that creates transformation in our lives? What happens? What's the mechanism of it? Anybody? Any thoughts on that? It forces us to reconfigure. Tell us a little bit more about that, Anthony. What do you mean by that?
Well, if we stay within our comfort zone,
Right.
we are satisfied.
Okay.
The behavior is a response to a need.
Yeah, so behavior is a response to a need, so a sensation of dissatisfaction means we have to reconfigure, we have to rethink, we have to renew action. Yeah, it disrupts us, right? It disrupts us. Yeah, Paris.
Also change, it alters our mind. I suspect physically from like a cellular level, it develops the brain more, because through challenge, we either rise to it and develop, or we stay stagnant.
Yeah, okay, so it's another, the challenge creates intention and yeah.
I think in our darkest times is when we turn to God.
It causes us to turn to God. Okay, that's great. Anybody else? Edward.
I think it puts things into perspective, and it helps you realize what's really important in your life.
Right, so it's kind of, it helps you reevaluate, you maybe see a bigger picture. You talk about reevaluating, maybe reevaluating yourself. Yeah. Is there any more? Jennifer?
When everything's coming along fine, you have the illusion that you're in control, and when you suffer, you realize that you're not in control.
Yeah, so control. So when everything's going fine, you have the illusion that you're in control. You may not be, but it seems that you are. Suffering shows you don't have control. Okay? It proves it to you. Yeah, we'll do one last one then. Okay, yeah, so like when bad things happen, I'm sort of extrapolating a little bit of what you're saying, but when bad things happen, somehow it creates an environment or an opportunity for incredible good to happen, right? I mean, we see in human history, in awful situations of, you think about let's take something, you know, in the last 100 years, you know, a horrible issue of the Holocaust. There are stories within it of incredible beauty and kindness and forgiveness that just, it's hard to imagine where those could have come from. It doesn't, I mean, I'm not saying, oh, isn't it good therefore that we have all this suffering because it produces good, but somehow it challenges people to respond in a beautiful way. Angela, I'm going to give you, well, you can be the last word on it. Define it all for us right now, okay? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so now we're all talking very jollily about suffering, like, oh, it helps us do this and it helps us do that. Okay, when we're in it can not feel like that. Okay, so again, you know, I think that part of the challenge here is suffering so subjective. I almost feel nervous to talk about it because I could start talking about, oh, what I've suffered with, and you might be like, oh, that's nothing. Right? And haven't we all experiences where we even feel reticent to talk about our own experience, maybe because it doesn't seem like it's that bad, and we've all talked to other people where they've shared things with us and we're like, and the problem is? But then we've also talked with people and we thought, I don't know how you're still standing. How do you survive that? How do you go through that? You know, and they're like, oh, well, I've got through, you know, like, how do you do? So it's also subjective. It's a hard subject to talk about, I think. But thank you for all those that shared. So we have this, let's go back to this issue of disruption. Like, it seems like suffering shakes things up so that we see things differently. We see our need to change. We maybe discover new things about ourselves. Somebody mentioned it helps us reach out to God. We maybe, I mean, Jennifer mentioned about we lose control. We become aware that control was an illusion. And so we need to look elsewhere. We might look to God. I'm not sure if anybody mentioned this, but haven't you found like in suffering, we tend to reach out to others in a way that maybe we wouldn't have done? We become more vulnerable. We see our need of other people. And we open up a little bit more to others. We are more dependent on others. Sometimes in suffering, we experience people carrying us through. And that might not be in line with our nature to ask for help or to expect help, but in certain situations we need help. We can't survive without help, and we ask for it. So I think, and again, I'm not sort of particularly bought into that God is a being that sort of looks down on the earth. Oh, a little bit of suffering there, a little bit of this. You have that because that will help you out. I don't think we should see it like that. Suffering happens, and in that suffering, it creates an opportunity for us to respond. And of course we can respond. We can become victims, we can just become mad and angry and bitter, we can become lonely and isolated, we can become angry at life and pursue happiness even more. So I don't deserve this. And we can take all those responses, and some of those are very understandable responses. I've participated in many of those myself with great gusto. But we also have this opportunity for it to be transformative. So that's one thing about suffering. It doesn't explain it, but it's something we've noticed about it. Let's look at a couple of scriptures. In Romans, Paul, the sort of early church leader, he gets into this. He says, "Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. And we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also rejoice in our sufferings." It sounds a bit masochistic at first, but we rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, character, and character hope. And hope does not disappoint us because God has poured out his love in our hearts by the Holy Spirit, whom he has given us. Maybe we could just look at not the message version of that, but we'll go on to the next scripture. Maybe we could skip over that one. Just look at the next one. So this is James. So James was the brother of Jesus. He wrote a letter to the early church as well. He says, "Consider it sheer gift, friends, when tests and challenges come at you from all sides. You know that under pressure, your faith life is forced into the open and shows its true colors. So don't try to get out of anything prematurely. Let it do its work so you can mature and well developed, not deficient in any way." It's interesting that I find that those things there make so much sense when you're past suffering, right? Or before you go into suffering. In some ways, that's, let's be careful about advice giving those scriptures when somebody's in the middle of it all. Because, rejoice because this is producing something great in you. What we're saying is, we can agree with that because we're looking back and saying, yeah. And perhaps what we can say is, don't give up, don't give up, don't give up, don't give up, don't give up. And some of us, that's maybe what we need to hear right now. Don't give up, don't give up. No matter what you go through, don't give up. Now here's something else I want to say about suffering. God suffers. I mean, we are spiritual people here, we're religious people, we're people who've come to church. Many of us here would say we're followers of Jesus. And we're following somebody who suffers. This is what it says in the prophet Isaiah, talking about someone who we believe is Jesus. These are words of Isaiah about 8 centuries or 7 centuries before Jesus. That since Jesus' life, we've come to think maybe these were prophetically talking about Jesus. Either way, this is spiritual language that we can still apply to the subject matter. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we would desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. It's not hard to see how people would associate that with Jesus. Clearly Jesus suffered. That language seems very tuned in to the Messiah, the person we would say is the Messiah, Jesus Christ. God comes into our lives in our suffering. Again, this doesn't explain suffering. It doesn't necessarily help us understand it anymore. But here's something that personally I have experienced, and I think from the people that were responding that you've experienced, which is that we find God and God finds us in the context of suffering. God doesn't stand back from suffering like, well, here's a bit of suffering for you, see how you get on with that. God comes into the suffering with us, and God has actually experienced suffering. The scriptures, the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures, are full of language of God experiencing pain, experiencing sorrow, experiencing remorse even, experiencing heartbreak, experiencing jealousy, experiencing all kinds of emotions that say God is an emotive, emotional being. Very different to the ancient religious view of God, which was the gods, or the God was removed and sort of very unchangeable, very unemotional. No, this Hebrew God that Jesus talked about, and Jesus himself was somebody we associate with emotion, we associate with sorrow, we associate with pain, we associate with struggle. And somebody mentioned that when we experience suffering, somehow we throw ourselves on God, or perhaps God becomes even more real. Maybe God is close with the brokenhearted. That's what the scriptures say. That our suffering kind of takes away a veneer that just makes us rawly and vulnerable, open and connected to God. And in that moment, God meets us. And in that sense, God is the ultimate empathizer. Okay, God is not saying, you really should do better with this suffering. Come on, do better with the suffering. God is the ultimate empathizer, saying, I've suffered too, I'm with you in this, I'm with you in this. I remember when, so empathy actually, I don't think that came out when we were sharing about suffering, but doesn't suffering kind of make us more empathetic? Even if we haven't suffered in the same way that somebody else is suffering, the fact that we've all suffered somehow softens us to other people's calamity, other people's struggles, other people's suffering, right? And God is the ultimate empathizer because God suffers, right? And I remember when my eldest daughter Megan, when she was 8 years old, she got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So she goes into hospital, and it's not the end of the world. Okay, many people have been through way worse things than that. Okay, so but it was a time of stress in our lives, certainly a time of stress in her life, a time of stress as a parent. And I remember this woman. I don't know exactly what her role was, but Megan, my daughter, was in the hospital, and this woman came in to coach her. It was like coaching her on how to do her injections and some dietary issues and that kind of thing. She was kind of like a support worker. And she came in, and she just had this really beautifully tender way with my daughter. I've got my daughter, my 8-year-old daughter, who's so precious, and this woman was treating her like she was that precious. But I noticed the woman had this big scar. It was like, I think she'd probably been burned on one side of her face. And I looked into her eyes and I thought, man, you have suffered. You have suffered. There was just a look that she had that just said she had suffered. But there was such kindness about her. And I couldn't help separate those two things out. It was like, as she was talking to my daughter about effectively a disability and how she was going to cope with this, she seemed to be talking out of a depth that came from her own suffering, in a way that maybe she couldn't have done had she not suffered that way. Again, it doesn't explain suffering, but somehow we can empathize more. It's like the issue of failure, which is obviously so tied up with suffering. Do we really want to talk to somebody about our own failure when we know that they've never failed? It's somehow failure and suffering bring us closer to God, but they bring us closer to one another. We have a sense of much deeper commonality, I think, through the point of suffering. Now let's just turn to the story of Palm Sunday. Okay? And we're going to read that from Matthew chapter 21. And then we're going to connect this to what we've been talking about. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you'll find a donkey tied there with a colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, tell them that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to the daughter of Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did just as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt, placed their cloaks on them, and Jesus sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And some versions will say it's palm trees. You know, the inference is that these are the palms. The crowds that went ahead of him and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna," which is kind of like an exclamation of holiness and royalty, and it comes up all sorts of images. "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." Okay, so this is Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. If you read in versions like that was in the New International Version, often there's a subheading that's not part of the original text, but just a subheading of what this next passage is about. Often it says, the triumphal entry. So this is an entry into Jerusalem that we talk about every year. It leads up to Easter. Okay, Jesus is coming. It's the final stage of Jesus' ministry, and in fact, the final stage of his life, on planet Earth, his life as we know it. And it's a story full of paradox, because here is Jesus being greeted like a king. As we've said many times before, these palms were actually symbols of rebellion. They were symbols of Palestinian nationalism. They were symbols, these people like waving independence flags. And Jesus is coming in at a time of heightened political tension, because it's the Passover, right? And the Passover was the time when, historically, the people of Israel were liberated from the tyranny of Egypt. They were set free from the slavery of Egypt. So there's this sense that Jesus has come to set us free. Jesus the King. Jesus is going to be crowned King. Jesus is going to overthrow the Romans. There's all these expectations about Jesus, all these definitions of what success is. And if we go back to the story of the Passover, I think it's really interesting to think through what were people's expectations of Jesus as defined by the Passover. Okay, so there's this notion of liberation. In what way is Jesus the liberator? Well, if Jesus is going to come in and kick Roman butt and set people free, in many ways then, there's an expectation that he's going to be like the angel of death. Okay, there's a dark side to the Passover story. And that is that there were 10 plagues, the final one of which was the firstborn child of every Egyptian family was killed during the night by the angel of death. I mean, it's awful. It's horrible. It's a horrible thing to think about. And that's what finally persuaded Pharaoh to let people go. He was like, okay, go, because he had lost his own son. He eventually changed his mind again and chased after them. But that was what caused them to give up, give up power and let the people go. And so that's one way of dealing with the problem of evil. Jesus comes in, and Jesus is going to play out the role of the angel of death. He's going to start, taking control. He's going to have to put certain people down, wrest power from certain people, and set the people free. And this is expectation. Really, maybe it's not thought through that Jesus is going to play that kind of role. That's why they're cheering him on. But Jesus is coming into Jerusalem knowing, oh no, I'm not the angel of death. I'm the Lamb. I'm that lamb that you killed that night and sacrificed and painted the blood over the doorway of your homes, so that the angel of death wouldn't come in the house and would pass over. Okay, that's all part of the story. It's called Passover because the angel of death would see sacrificial blood over the lintel of the homes of the Israeli people, the people of Israel, and would not go in, and they would be spared this monstrosity. And we can say all kinds of things about that story, but Jesus is saying, I'm not the angel of death, I'm the sacrificial lamb. I've come to deal with a much bigger problem. I'm going to come and deal with the very root of evil itself. And it's going to be overcome not by the angel of death, but by the lamb, the sacrificial lamb. It's going to be overcome by love and self-sacrifice. And so Jesus walks this pathway of palms And this morning we're going to, oops, fortunately there's no water in there. We're going to make a pathway ourselves. We're going to do that with the palms in a moment, by just sort of putting these out. Because they didn't really put them on the floor. It seems like they put the coats on the floor, but I didn't know whether you'd be willing to do that. But they wave the palms. But we're going to just make a pathway. We can make them get up there and up there. And we'll do that in a second. But Jesus walked this pathway into Jerusalem, which was a pathway of suffering. He chose a pathway that would lead to suffering. He knew, he had at least a lot of insight that this was going to lead to his death. And he chose that pathway because there was a higher calling. There was a bigger issue. There was another agenda beyond simply his happiness. And I don't want to be patronizing or negate any of our desires for happiness. I want to be happy. Heck, don't we all want to be happy? But there's something more to life than that. And I think it's found in this issue of sacrifice that many of us, actually, in this room, I don't know who you are, but many of us have made decisions in life where our happiness was not the ultimate goal. We've sacrificed things for people, for family members, for friends. We've maybe made career choices. We've made vacation choices. We've made money choices. We've made all sorts of different choices for the good of others. And again, we could get into all sort of self-martyrdom about that, and we could get into fake humility and pat ourselves on the back. We're not going to do that, right? That's not what this is about. It's saying, there's something more to life. There is something more to life. There's more to this life than me. There's more to this life than me and my happiness. There's a higher calling. There's a bigger thing to live for. And I think Jesus reaches into our suffering, reaches into our happiness, reaches into our whole lives, and beckons us to follow along this pathway, which is partnership, which will ultimately result in the alleviation of suffering for others, which will result in us standing with others in their suffering. It will result in us making choices that actually, ironically, don't have our interests at the top of the agenda, but in the end become ultimately so much more fulfilling, so much more meaningful for us. And I think we've all, to some degree, experienced that. But we also get caught in the trap that the ultimate goal of life is to be happy. And we invest our time and energy and whatever we have in trying to achieve that. Maybe God is calling to us to something even more beautiful. And maybe it's in the context of suffering, as we have just talked about it, that our eyes get opened up to that we get jolted out of this pattern we're in, and we have this potential to see life differently and to see this bigger picture, to see this higher calling. So this morning we're going to take communion together, and when you come up and have communion, either before or after, let's just take our palms. If you've got palms, use the ones you've got. There's also a couple of tables at the back which have fresh palms on them. And let's just make a couple of pathways, right? One up through there and one up through there. We can just put these things down. And then at some point during the worship, I just invite you, encourage you, we've got a whole bunch of them, to walk this pathway. Most people on Palm Sunday are going to be waving their palms. We're going to be trampling them into the ground. But we're going to walk this pathway, and we're going to walk. It's a symbolic pathway. It's like Jesus walking into Jerusalem. It's a choice we're going to make to walk this pathway. And maybe we can think about it in the light of two things. We might walk this pathway and say, Jesus, we're walking this pathway with you because I need to know that you're with me and what I'm going through. And this is kind of like an act of faith. It's to say, God, you're with me, and I'm not going to give up. And this is a hard pathway I'm having to walk at the moment. It's almost unbearable, and I need to know that you're with me. And it's an invitation to God to join you in this pathway. I mean, really what we're doing is the other way around in reality. Jesus is inviting us to join him in this pathway, in his suffering. But we're just going to say, we're going to look at it that way around and say, God, be with me. Please be with me in what I'm going through. The other way of looking at it is to say, Jesus, With everything I have, I choose to follow you. I choose to follow your pathway into Jerusalem. I choose to follow your pathway of sacrifice. As we walk this pathway, what we can actually say is, God, my life is not my own. My life's not my own. It's not my happiness is not the biggest deal in the universe. And I don't want to be miserable. And I don't want to suffer. I'm just being honest now. This is my prayer. God, I don't want to be miserable. I don't want to suffer. I want to be happy. But I'm not going to make that the greatest priority for me in the universe. There's something more. My life's not my own. I'm going to walk this pathway with you. And I don't know where it's going to lead. I don't know what you're going to ask me to do. Maybe there are some specific challenges we know about right now that we can relate to. That things that we sense God wanting us to give up, or things that God wants us to do. Certain things we're wrestling with. That may be very obvious. Or it may not be right now. It may just be that, Jesus, here I am. I want to follow you. I'm going to follow you along this pathway. You've called us to sacrifice, not selfishness. You've called us to meaning and reality and love and giving our lives for the sake of others, as opposed to protecting our own interests and this continual addiction to happiness, to personal happiness. There's something beautiful about that. That can sound, as we've said, that could just be self-martyrdom and holier than thou and all the rest of it. Or it could be this beautiful invitation and this beautiful response on our part. Okay, so we're going to have communion. The communion ceremony is a celebration, a remembrance of the last meal Jesus had with his followers, where after which he paid the ultimate sacrifice. And he took bread. It was Passover bread. They were celebrating the Passover. And he said, this is my body broken for you. I mean, he's just basically saying, my life's not my own. My life is not mine. And so here it is. It's broken for you. It's given away. And you know, in that breaking, such healing comes. That's the paradox. That's the irony of all this. That in that breaking, there's incredible paradox. In the shedding of blood, and he took the wine, he said, this is the blood of the new covenant, he called it, for various reasons. But in this is forgiveness. In the shedding of blood, in sacrifice, in self-sacrifice, is love and forgiveness and reconciliation. There's a response, you know, hatred sheds blood. It's a symbol of suffering. And yet, Jesus redefines this and says, through this, suffering is alleviated, the reconciliation happens. So we can come, eat the bread, and kind of say, my life's not my own. My life's not my own. We can drink the cup, the wine, and say, I'm yours. You know, the cup also, you know, there's another sort of metaphor we could use even for this, which we've mentioned some